Hello, my name is Harzing, and today we'll be talking about research strategies and the trade-offs you make when you choose a particular research strategy or research design. Before I start, I would like to extend a big thank you to Professor Carol Kulik. She prepared the initial version of these slides at the University of Melbourne and very graciously shared them with me when she left and I took over the session. Carol has been the most wonderful colleague and I still miss her. So what will we be doing today? Well, first of all, we'll talk about triangulation and why we use different research strategies to look at the same research problem. We'll also discuss the detailed trade-offs between the individual research strategies, and we'll discuss four main categories of strategies. I will then illustrate this with an example by a prior PhD student who had a very creative research design. Then in the final part of the session, we'll be talking about matching different research methods, quantitative and qualitative methods, and match them to the state of the field. We will obviously, during the session, practice all of this by applying this to your own research topic. Remember this one? This is the cycle of empirical research. We discussed it in the first session on literature reviews and showed how doing a rigorous literature review is important for nearly every step of the empirical research cycle. Today, we'll be specifically talking about two steps, the study design, or rather the research strategies, and how to operationalize these research strategies in terms of methods. Okay, so on to the first session. Why do we use triangulation? So why do we use triangulation? Well, for the very simple reason that all research strategies are seriously flawed. That could be depressing in a way, but it could also bring a sense of relief because it's not possible to design the perfect research strategy. And that's why we like triangulation. So what is triangulation? Triangulation simply means using different research strategies to study the same phenomenon. The multiple viewpoints that you get with different research strategies allow for greater accuracy and the ability to uncover unique variants that might have gone unnoticed when you use a single strategy. Using different research strategies often means using both quantitative and qualitative methods as complementary methods, but it could also mean purely quantitative methods and purely qualitative methods, just different types of methods. We will come back to this repeatedly in the session, and it's all about expanding your horizons. So you can really make a well-informed choice in studying the topic of your PhD. It's not necessarily about making a different choice than the one you were intending originally, but making an informed choice. So as the next step, we'll look at the specific research design trade-offs. The reading I set for today, McGrath, provides a typology that sees designing a particular research strategy as facing a three-horn dilemma. It is a typology that describes the behavior of actors in a particular context. Actors, behavior, context. So the typology says that you can either focus on actors and try and achieve the highest level of generalisability by studying a representative sample of actors. Or you can focus on behavior and try to measure that behavior as precisely and rigorously as possible. Or you can focus on the specific context and make sure that the relevance and realism of that context is as high as possible. But what the typology says is that you can't have all three at the same time. You can't design a research strategy that is both highly generalizable, and precise and highly relevant. So what you can do is compromise between two of them and forget about the third, or focus on purely one of them and then forget about the two others. So this might still seem a little bit abstract. So in the next slide, we'll look at how to improve one of the three and the trade-off you're facing with the others. Okay, so how do these trade-offs work in practice if you're designing a research strategy? Well, first, let's assume you are focusing on precision, the precision with which you measure the behavior. You could do this, for instance, by designing a laboratory experiment. In doing so, you are reducing the realism and naturalness of the situation as you are conducting the experiment in a laboratory setting, which is not a real setting. You're also reducing generalisability, the number of actors to which your results can be applied, because you're usually focusing on a specific group of people. So let's assume, on the other hand, then, that you are trying to increase the realism of the context. You could, for instance, conduct a field study in a natural environment where you conduct a case study or interview people, or even do a small scale survey, because remember, whether a survey is a field study or a sample survey really depends on the size and the representativeness of the survey. So doing a field study, let's assume a case study or interviews, this necessarily limits the generalizability of your study because you cannot include a large representative number of actors. It also reduces the precision of the information that you can generate, because unlike, for instance, a laboratory experiment, you cannot actually manipulate the behavior. So you cannot be sure which variable causes another variable. So that's context. So then let's assume you're trying to increase the generalizability of your study, focusing on the actors instead, by conducting a large-scale sample study with a population that's representative of the general population. In this case, you're meeting the generalizability part, but you are reducing realism because you are obtaining the information out of context. You're asking people to fill out a survey. You're not interacting with them in their natural environment. So they might respond very differently if you did that. In addition, you are reducing precision because you are only able to measure a limited number of variables. And unlike in a laboratory study, you cannot control for the other variables that are unmeasured. So the trade-offs of the three different foci, whether you focus on actors' behavior and context, are very, very different. Okay, I realize that this might all sound still a little bit abstract. So let's now go to the four main categories of strategies that McGrath distinguishes. So we'll look at four main categories, and in each category, we discuss two specific research strategies that I will illustrate with an example. So if we look at the four specific categories first of all, if we look at the blue side, these are what we call field strategies. And there are two distinct strategies, a field experiment or a field study. Then the second quadrant is basically the experimental strategies, and they can be experimental simulations or lab experiments. Then the third quadrant is basically focusing on the actors. And that's why we call them respondent strategies. And there are, again, two specific strategies, which we call judgment tasks and sample survey. And then finally, quadrant 4, which is the purplish reddish category, we call conceptual theoretical strategies, because they don't include empirical research. So there are two strategies here: formal theory and computer simulation. You will also see positioned on this pie A, B, and C. So these are actor, behavior, and context that we talked about before. They are positioned such that the strategies that address these three aspects best are closest to these letters. So if we look at the first quadrant, the field strategies, they are strongest on context, because they measure behavior in a naturally occurring context. Then if we look at the second quadrant, experimental studies, they are strongest on precision of measuring behavior, because they can manipulate behavior within an experimental context and controlling for all other variables. And then the actor element is positioned close to the sample survey, which is basically sampling a representative proportion of the population. So this strategy is strongest on the actor side. So you can already see that if you would go to an opposite quadrant, for instance, quadrant 3, it wouldn't be very high on realism, on context. If you would go to the field study, it wouldn't be very high on behavioral precision. If you go to a field experiment or experimental simulation, it wouldn't be very high on the actor variable, so it would be very high on generalisability. So this already gives you some indications of the strengths and weaknesses of the different quadrants. So then let's move to a more specific discussion of each of the individual quadrants. First of all, we'll look at the field strategies. As I said, we will talk about two different strategies within this: the field study and the field experiments. Okay, let's take an example. And I've decided to take a slightly unusual group to work with: Canadian lumberjacks. I'm hoping that will allow you to remember the example better. We're looking at a topic that has been studied quite a bit in human resource management. And that is whether, if you involve someone in goal setting in their work, so setting goals for their work, whether that improves their performance in their work. And generally the idea is that if you are more involved in the goal setting, you will be more motivated and you will perform better. So a couple of really creative researchers conducted a field experiment where they randomly assigned logging crews to groups where goals were set in a participative way, or where goals were simply set by the manager, and the lumberjacks themselves didn't have any involvement in the goal setting. So this is a naturally occurring setting, because the lumberjacks were going on with their work in the normal way. It's just that one group was involved in the goal setting and another group was getting goals that were set by their managers. So there is quite a bit of control, because you controls that one group gets the participating goal, the other groups gets the managerial goal. So you have two distinct groups and you can measure whether the groups are different in terms of their performance. But it's also a bit of a noisy environment because you're not controlling for all the other variables that might influence performance. You might find that maybe the one group of lumberjacks goes out in a different part of the wood where the quality of the wood is much better. Or they happen to come across people who disturb the woods, and they're busy with those, so they're interrupted, so they perform less, even though they were involved in a participative goal setting. So you can't control all the variables because it's a natural setting and people are going along with their work in a natural way. So there's some experimental control, but not full experimental control. So it is realistic, so we're okay with context. There is some behavioral control. So how about generalizability? So can we generalize this study to other populations? Well, probably not, because we're not all Canadian lumberjacks, and even if participatory goal setting works for Canadian lumberjacks, we're not sure whether it works for other groups of employees. So it's really tricky to generalize this study to other groups of employees. You might be able to conduct other field experiments with other groups of employees. And then once you've done, say, 4 or 5 different studies with very different types of employees, if you still find the same result in every study, you can have a bit more confidence in its generalizability. So that's the field experiment. So then a second strategy in this quadrant of field studies would be, of field strategies, would be the field study. So in this case, we don't do any deliberate manipulation. So we don't have one group of lumberjacks that gets a managerial goal and one group of lumberjacks that are allowed to participate in the goal setting. No, all the lumberjacks participate in their own goal setting. All the crews set their own goals. So from one day on, all the groups are allowed to set their own goals, whereas in the past they didn't. So what you can do, obviously, is compare their performance in participatory goal setting to the past, when they were not allowed to do participatory goal setting. So you get some idea of whether or not the goal setting actually changes their behavior. But it's not very precise because time has passed. There might be lots of other factors that have changed in the environment between non-participatory goal setting and participatory goal setting. Maybe it's a different season, maybe they had new employees coming in, maybe there was an economic recession going on, so the motivation had changed. So lots of different things can change from one time period to another. So behavior wasn't really measured very precisely. It was, just like with the field experiment, a very natural setting because they were just going on with their job as normal. The only difference was that some time ago, they weren't allowed to participate in the goal setting, and now they are. So it's very natural, so it's high on context, but it's fairly low on precision of behavior. And then again, with the actor element, the generalizability element, again, it's not generalizable to other types of employees for the same reason for why a field experiment was not generalizable, because you're looking at only one group of people. So 2 field strategies. The field experiment has quite a bit of precision in measuring behavior. The field study does not. Both field experiment and field study are very much context driven. They are very much real. They very much operate in a natural environment. So they're good on context, but neither of them is good on generalizability, the actor part of the story. So low on generalizability, high on realism, on context. Field experiment, quite okay with precision, not perfect, but quite okay. Field study, quite low on precision of measurement of behavior. So that's quadrant 1, the field studies. So then we move on to quadrant 2, which are the experimental strategies. And we distinguish two experimental strategies: a lab experiment, laboratory experiment, and experimental simulation. As you can already see in this figure, both are high on precision. They measure behavior in a very precise way. They're not so good in either context, so the realism, or actors, generalizability, not generalizable to a large group of people. So let's look at this in a bit more detail in the next slide. Okay, so then we come to quadrant 2, which are basically the experimental strategies. And again, we have two strategies in this quadrant: the laboratory experiment and the experimental simulation. The difference between the two is mainly in the realism of the setting, which is very low in the laboratory experiment, so very low on context, and is a little bit higher in the experimental simulation. So a laboratory experiment would deliberately manipulate one or more variables in a laboratory. An example, for instance, is if we would conduct the same kind of goal-setting experiment. So would setting your own goals improve performance in whatever task you are set? We studied this with Canadian lumberjacks in their own natural context, in their own work environment, with a field experiment. But now we're studying it in the laboratory, and rather than using real employees, we use college students who are readily available and can be either paid or be required to participate in experiments to get study credits. So this experiment could ask students to build, say, helicopters with Lego, and say, well, you can have one group where they participate in a goal setting, and they indicate how many helicopters they want to build. The other group will not participate in the goal setting, and the experimenter will just give them a goal to work towards. So this setting is purely created for research purposes. Students don't go about building helicopters in their daily life. Well, one or two of them might, but in general, that's not what students do in their spare time. So the realism, the context is not very high. It's a very contrived setting. On the other hand, because you're conducting this in a laboratory and you're studying a very specific group of people, students maybe even studying a particular field, studying a particular degree, you can control for lots of other variables, because these people are studying this for the same degree. They're generally of a similar age. They are generally have similar backgrounds. So you are controlling for lots of other variables. And the only thing you manipulate is whether they are involved in the goal setting or not. So if you find a difference between these two groups, you can be pretty sure that it's due to the goal setting and not to dozens of other variables on which these two groups might differ. So a laboratory experiment, very good on precisely measuring behavior, not so good on realism, so context is low, and also not so good on generalizability, generalizing to the population as a whole, because you're studying students who are a very specific population, and this might not generalize to the population of working adults. So if students perform better in building helicopters with Lego blocks, if they can set their own goals rather than if they have their goals imposed on them, this doesn't mean that the same is true for employees in a work setting. So then, to address this problem with it not being a very realistic setting a little bit, you can use an experimental simulation. It's still similar in a sense that you deliberately manipulate one or more variables, but the setting is a little bit more realistic. So, for instance, you could think of if you go for a job interview, when you get an assessment center where you're asked to conduct particular jobs, and your performance in these jobs is measured. So again, you could look at a participatory goal setting, whether you're set a particular goal or whether you set your own goals in the assessment center and can measure the behavior. Can measure the difference between these two groups. So again, the precision of measuring behavior is fairly high. It's a little bit lower than with the laboratory experiment, but it's fairly high. The context is a little bit more realistic than a laboratory experiment. So it's a little better on C, but again, it's not very high on generalizability, because it's still a very specific group of people. You're conducting these experimental simulations generally with a student population. As another example, a study that I've conducted a while ago is where we had students participate in a prisoner's dilemma game, where as competitors in a particular industry, they could choose to set either a high price or a low price. If they set a low price, they capture the whole market. If they set a high price and the competitor sets a low price, they lose the whole market. So it's in both of their interests to set the price high, because then they have their income high, but they have a natural inclination to set the price lower, so they capture the market. So this is the prisoner's dilemma game element of it. So what we asked students to do is to play this game, but the actual manipulation was, and they weren't aware of this, is that one group of students was asked to play this game in their native language, which in this case was Dutch. And the other group of students was asked to play the game in English, because we wanted to establish whether the language in which the game was played had an impact on the level of cooperative choices. And cooperative choices in this case were setting a high price, or competitive choices, and in this case were operationalized as setting a low price, trying to capture the market by undercutting your competitor. In case you were interested in what the results were, they were actually more likely to behave competitively when they were playing in English than when they were playing in Dutch. But this was only true if they had had significant exposure to Anglophone culture by spending some time in either the UK or the US. If you're interested in reading more about it, I'm happy to give you the reference in the face-to-face session. So again, it's kind of a half realistic situation, because students can imagine that they work in a company and they're allowed to set the price for the product, but it's not a naturally occurring situation. So it's a bit higher on realism than the laboratory experiment, but certainly not as high as a field experiment. So to sum up, laboratory experiment, experimental simulation, they are both very, very low on generalizability, because they're generally conducted with a very specific population, in most cases, students. They are both relatively low, they're both low on realism, but the experimental simulation is a bit higher on realism than the laboratory experiment. They're both fairly high on precision of measuring behavior, but the laboratory experiment is higher on precision than the experimental simulation. Okay, then we get to category 3, which are what we call the respondents strategies, in which there is a key focus on selecting the right respondents. These two strategies differ quite a bit in how they perform in terms of the 3 dilemmas. So the sample survey is really very good in terms of generalizability. That's why the A is very close to the sample survey. The judgment task is not hopeless at generalizability, but it's not as good as the sample survey. And it's between the A and the B, so it's a little bit better than many strategies on generalizability. And it's also quite okay at precision of measurement of behavior. So that's why it's between the A and the B. Both of them, though, are not really very good in realism of the situation, in naturalness of the situation, because they are not measuring behavior in a real context. So let's move on to some examples. So if we look at quadrant 3, the respondent strategies, we see a clear focus on selecting the right respondents. The 2 strategies within this are quite distinct. We have the sample survey and the judgment task. The sample survey is something that most of you will be quite familiar with, even if it's only in terms of opinion polling, which is done at a societal level. We do sample surveying in business and management quite frequently. And this involves sending out a survey to a random sample of employees or consumers. And this is something that's done quite often in subdisciplines such as organizational behavior, human resource management, or consumer behavior. And you could think of, for instance, sending a survey on bullying to a random sample of employees, or a survey on purchase intention to a random sample of consumers. However, you can also use a sample survey by surveying organizations. So you are obviously asking individuals to complete the survey, because organizations cannot complete the survey, but you're asking a key informant in the organization to respond to the survey on behalf of the organization. This is a strategy that is quite common in strategic management, in operations management, international business, and marketing management. So a survey sent to organizations with a key informant responding to the survey. However, it needs to be a random sample of organizations to be qualifying as a sample survey. If you are sending a survey to a small group of organizations in a particular industry, or in a particular country, or a small subset of organizations such as multinational corporations or small and medium-sized enterprises, that's not called a sample survey. That is what McGrath called a field study. So you can use surveys both in quadrant 3 and in quadrant 1, and the difference is on the level of generalizability. Okay, then the second main strategy in this category is the judgment task. And I must admit, this is a strategy that I'm not very familiar with. It's also not one that I've seen used in a lot of studies in business and management. So I'm struggling a little bit to explain this clearly. But the way to think about this is that the emphasis here is really on the respondents. So you're very carefully selecting respondents who are able to judge on a particular topic. For instance, let's take bullying again as an example. You can ask organizational decision makers, in this case, this could be a HR officer charged with addressing cases of bullying. And you could write a scenario with different types of bullying or different levels of bullying, and trying to capture how the key decision maker responds to these different scenarios, how they make a judgment on the different tasks. So a lot of time is spent on crafting the right task, crafting the right setting for the participants and for the right participants to provide an opinion. Again, this is not a strategy that is used very often in business and management. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it or you can't use it. It just means that there is less material to draw on for you. On the other hand, it also means that if you can apply it successfully, that you have a unique advantage. So to summarize, these two strategies are both not great on context. They are not studying behavior in a naturally occurring context. One of them, the sample survey, is really good on generalizability. The judgment task is okay on generalizability, but not as good as the sample survey. The judgment task is quite good at measuring behavior precisely, much better than the sample survey, but not as good as the experimental studies. Okay, so that was quadrant number 3. Okay, and then last but not least, quadrant 4. These are what we call the theoretical strategies. Again, there are 2 specific strategies within this general category: formal theory or literature reviews and computer simulation. As you can see from the pie, neither of them are very good in precision of measuring behavior, simply because there is no behavior to measure, because these do not involve empirical work, so they do not involve real people. They differ a little bit in the extent to which they are good in terms of generalizability. Literature review can be quite good, formal theory can be quite good, computer simulation slightly less so. On the other hand, computer simulation is generally better in terms of realism and context. So let's look at this in a bit more detail by looking at some examples. Okay, let's look at some examples for quadrant 4, the theoretical strategies. So neither of these strategies are very strong on measuring behavior precisely, simply because there is no behavior to measure, because there are no actual research participants or people involved in these strategies. If we look at the computer simulation, all the outcomes are computer generated. An example could be, for instance, trying to estimate or growth of organizational revenue based on assumptions about pricing of your products, about consumer behavior of your customers, and building a model based on what you know from the field. So you are incorporating some of the contextual realism, some of the reality in your model, but you're not actually studying behavior. So this strategy has a relatively high level of realism if you can build in some of this context. It has a low level of precision of measuring behavior because you're not actually measuring behavior. It has a relatively okay level of generalizability as long as the model is sound and you run the simulation often enough to gather enough information to test the model. Okay, then the final strategy, number 8, is really only looking at previous research and summarizing that research to create new models for testing. So again, there are no actual research participants or people involved, so there's really no behavior to be measured. It's also not high on contextual realism because you're not looking at people in a particular context. You're really looking at past research. In that way, it can be quite good on generalizability, because if you summarize what all the previous literature has done on a topic, you're usually not just summarizing other conceptual articles, you're also summarizing past empirical evidence. So in that way, it can be high on generalizability if you pick individual articles that have looked at different sorts of populations, that have followed different research strategies, but you're not actually doing an empirical study yourself. This is not typically something that you would do in a PhD, because a PhD would always involve empirical work, but it is something you might do for an individual research article. Okay, so these were all the 8 strategies that are identified in the McGrath model. I hope they are a little bit clearer now in terms of the extent to which they meet the demands for generalizability, precision of measurement of behavior, and contextual realism. But I'm hoping that by giving another really extensive example of an actual PhD project, you will get a better appreciation of how you can be using different strategies within the same project. So that's what we will turn to next. But first, before I do so, I would like you to have a look at this particular activity, because this is something that we will do in the live session. I would like you to reflect on the current literature in your research field and think about what you think the dominant research strategy is in your research field. So is it an experimental type of strategy? Is it a fields strategy? Is it a respondent strategy, or is it a theoretical strategy? And maybe within all of those categories, identify a specific strategy that you think has been used very often in the field of research that you're intending to study in your PhD. And then also think a little bit about what this might mean for the level of generalizability, precision, and realism in your field. If your field has predominantly used a particular strategy, what is the impact of that on generalizability, precision, and realism? I realize that many of you are still very early on in your PhD, so you might not have a clear idea about this yet. So that's not a problem at all, but just try to think about it a little bit so you come prepared to the session, and we can discuss each other's projects in these terms. Okay, now that we have discussed all of the 8 strategies in turn, each with some examples, I would like to give you one more quite extensive example of what I consider to be a very creative use of research strategies. And this was actually a real PhD project by a PhD student at the University of Melbourne. So this is the PhD student in question, Michael Carrington. She studied ethical consumer behavior and tried to understand why some consumers would have ethical intentions, but might not behave ethically in terms of ethical consumption. So they intended to buy ethically, but they didn't do so in practice. Her research strategy really had three sequential stages, where she first of all had focused on ethnographic case studies, then did natural field experiments, and then intended to do survey research. But in the end, she did that after her PhD because it all became a little bit too much to do all three in her PhD study. So in the first initial phase, so that was the ethnographic case studies, which is really a field strategy, she tried to understand very deeply why people would say they would behave in one way, but then actually behaved in another way. So she tried to really understand the behavior through the consumer's eyes. And then in the second and the third phase, she tried to add to this deep understanding a level of robustness and validity and generalizability. So she tried to add precision in the measurement of behavior through their experimental study and also generalizability through a survey. So before she actually chose her specific research strategy, she did a literature review on what previous studies in the field had done. Remember when we talked about a literature review last week, I said that you can use a literature review not just to come up with a research question and to review what other studies have found in the area, but also to review what research design other studies have found. And this is exactly what she did. And this is exactly what I'm asking you to reflect on as an exercise before you come to class. So she did this for two topics, the purchase intention behavior gap and the ethical consumer behavior literature. This doesn't mean a lot to me personally, and it wouldn't mean a lot to any of you working outside the marketing area, but these were two distinct areas in her study. What she did find is that most of the studies in the field had used either surveys or had only done literature reviews. First things she did is an ethnographic study because she wanted to more deeply understand why consumers behave the way they did. So within this, she used a wide range of methods. She used semi-structured interviews. She did participant observation, where she even accompanied shoppers to the shop and hang out with them in social settings. She also asked participants to make video diaries with disposable cameras. And she even, which I thought was very original, looked at shopping dockets, so shopping receipts. So this is really, in this context, archival data, so that you could actually see what consumers had bought. And she also used what she called metaphorical techniques. I can't quite remember what she meant with this, but I think it was linked with the video and photo images. So all in all, a really original set of methods used within a particular research strategy of the case study. Then outside the case study, and the case study, remember in this case, is the individual consumer. So this is the case she is studying. So she had a number of case studies of individual consumers on a really deep level. Then outside the case study, she also did mystery shopping, so looking in shops, how people actually behaved, and ethnography. So she conducted ethnography on the internet, visiting different fora and sites where consumers interact. Then in the second phase of her study, she used field strategies, conducting a field experiment and a field study. I won't go into any of the details of what she did in these specific research strategies, because that would take too much time. But she used, in this case, field research, field strategies, but had a field experiment and a field study. So within the field strategies, she used two different strategies. And then as a last phase, she intended to have a representative sample survey to test the whole conceptual model that she had the whole conceptual model that she had developed and refined in phase 1 and 2, and send it to Australian consumers and then possibly also all over the world. But obviously that was a step too far for just a PhD. And I already think that she did a huge amount in phase 1 and 2, and much more than most PhD students would have done. And that's why I've taken her as an example, because she was an exceptional PhD student, also having worked in the field herself for quite a while. So she had a lot of contextual knowledge. So if we look at the pie again, and we can place what she did in different parts of the pie. And this is where the prior research was. Most of the previous research simply conducted literature reviews. Then in her case, she conducted case studies with individual consumers using 7 distinct methods, from participant observation to looking at their shopping receipts, to hanging out with them in social settings, to conducting ethnography. And then she conducted a field experiment in which she set up an experiment in a shop and looked at how consumers behaved in the shop. She also did a small scale survey, so not a sample survey, a small scale survey, giving questionnaires to individual consumers. What she had intended to do as a follow-up was a random sample of consumers, and first of all in Australia, and then a random sample of non-Australian consumers. But as I indicated before, this was a step too much for her PhD, in which she had already done a number of different studies within the same quadrant. So this shows very clearly how you can study the same topic with a range of different research strategies. She could have designed a lab experiment as well. She could have used an experimental simulation. In this case, she used mostly field strategies, complemented with a sample survey. I'd also be interested in how this worked out for her after her PhD, because some of you might also be intending to start an academic career after the PhD. And as you can see from her Google Scholar profile, it worked out very well for her. She has a significant number of publications and a large and quickly growing number of citations over the year. And she followed a very interesting publication strategy. She published a conceptual article early on in her PhD studies, after she had conducted her literature review. And then she published her qualitative empirical work that came from the field strategies shortly after her PhD. And then after that, having published a conceptual article and an empirical article, she became known as an expert in the fields of ethical consumption, because there weren't that many people working in that field at the moment. So having published a conceptual article and an empirical article in the field really put her high up on the agenda. So she edited a special issue on the topic, and was also invited to write a chapter in a compendium and handbook on the topic. And then in June 2018, with two other academics in the field, she edited a book with contributions from academics working in this area. And this was quite a while after finishing her PhD. And by then, the research area had expanded to such an extent that an edited book was a worthwhile contribution. And then more recently, she's been venturing out in related areas in consumer activism, and discussing how, as a consumer, we can, by consuming ethically, also change society. So I think it's an interesting career story to see how, if you're focusing on a specific topic and use a variety of research strategies, you can end up publishing a lot of different articles and craft a position for yourself as an expert in the field. Okay, so this is all I wanted to say about different research strategies. I hope you have a slightly better idea now of how to apply these different strategies in your own PhD topic. So as an intermezzo too, I would also like you to think about this question. I've asked you first to identify which particular research strategies are dominant in your field of research. But now I also ask you to reflect on why you think these research strategies have become dominant. So there could be things like, well, it's simply the nature of the questions that are asked. So particular strategies are just more relevant. It could be the level of theoretical development in the area. If an area is still very new, then you're more likely to use field strategies to gain a deep understanding of a particular topic rather than sample surveys or experiments, because to do an experiment you need to know very precisely which variables to include, and if an area is really new, you still need to understand what is important. There might also be other aspects that are not related to the research as such. It might be funding sources, it might be skills of the individual researchers. Again, I'm not asking you to come back with a fully complete answer. I know you're only just starting in your PhD, but try to think about this a little bit, and we will try and have a discussion about this in the session.